Epictetus wrote that 2,000 years ago, from inside a life of forced servitude, he wasn't describing philosophy. He was describing a mechanism, the same mechanism that neuroscience would spend the 20th century trying to map, the gap between the expectation of pleasure and the experience of it, and what happens when that gap becomes permanent. Most people assume that the absence of excitement is a personal problem, a sign of depression or ingratitude, or a life insufficiently filled. But the brain doesn't stop producing excitement because something is wrong with the person. It stops because the prediction system has been recalibrated. And recalibration is not a mood. It is a structural change in how the nervous system processes anticipation. Understanding that distinction changes everything about what's actually happening. Dopamine is not the pleasure chemical. That is the most common and most costly misunderstanding in popular neuroscience. Dopamine is the prediction chemical. Its primary function is not to reward the experience of something good, but to signal the anticipation of something good that was not predicted. The surge of dopamine that the brain releases is not a response to pleasure. It is a response to surprise, to the gap between what was expected and what arrived. Neuroscientist Wolfram Schultz at the University of Fribourg spent the 1980s and 90s measuring dopamine responses in primates. His finding was precise and counterintuitive. Dopamine neurons fired not when the reward arrived, but when an unexpected cue predicted the reward was coming. And when the reward became fully predictable, the dopamine response moved entirely to the cue. The reward itself produced nothing. The brain had already moved on to the next prediction. This is the architecture of the reward system. It was built for an environment of scarcity and unpredictability. Intermittent food, rare shelter, occasional connection. In that environment, the system worked precisely as intended. Every unexpected reward produced a spike. Every spike reinforced the behavior that produced it. The system was elegant, efficient, and perfectly calibrated for a world that no longer exists. The central illusion is logical. If dopamine is released in anticipation of reward, then more stimulation should produce more dopamine, more novelty, more anticipation, more pleasure. The intuition is structurally sound. The biology disagrees at a very specific point, because the dopamine system doesn't add, it compares. It is a difference engine, and what it measures is the gap between prediction and reality. When stimulation becomes constant, prediction becomes perfect, and perfect prediction produces a dopamine response of precisely zero. This is what happens when a system built for intermittent, unpredictable reward is placed inside an environment of continuous, on-demand stimulation. The prediction engine calibrates upward. The baseline rises. What once produced a spike now produces maintenance. And maintenance feels like nothing, not pain, not suffering. The specific flatness that comes from a system that has learned to expect everything and is therefore surprised by nothing. Emerson wrote that in 1841, before radio, before cinema, before the infinite scroll, what he observed was the early version of a dynamic that the 21st century would industrialize. The system doesn't deliver satisfaction in proportion to stimulation. It delivers satisfaction in proportion to the gap between what was expected and what arrived. Reduce the gap to zero. Satisfaction disappears entirely. In the late 1990s, psychiatrist Anna Lemke at Stanford University began studying the relationship between chronic stimulation and what she called anhedonia by degrees, the gradual flattening of the capacity for pleasure that occurs not through trauma or illness, but through sustained overexposure to rewarding stimuli. Her finding was specific. The brain responds to chronic overstimulation not by producing more dopamine, but by reducing the number of dopamine receptors available. The sensitivity of the system decreases in proportion to the intensity of the input. Lemke called this the pleasure-pain balance. The brain maintains homeostasis by compensating for each spike in pleasure with a corresponding dip in its baseline state. The higher the spike, the deeper the dip, and with chronic overstimulation, the dips accumulate. The baseline migrates downward. The person's resting state, the emotional ground they return between stimulations, becomes flatter, duller, and increasingly resistant to ordinary sources of meaning. What Kierkegaard described as boredom in 1843, the specific despair of a self that can no longer be surprised by its own existence, maps with remarkable precision onto what Lemke documented neurologically 150 years later. The phenomenology preceded the mechanism, the feeling of flatness, of stimulation without genuine contact, of wanting without arriving. These are not metaphors. They are the subjective experience of a dopamine system that has reset its baseline upward and can no longer find the gap it was designed to measure. Eugene Delacroix kept one of the most detailed diaries in the history of French art. Across decades of entries, he returned repeatedly to a specific experience that he found impossible to name. Not unhappiness, not despair, something closer to what he called the exhaustion of appetite, a state in which the desire for experience had not diminished, but the capacity to be genuinely moved by it had. He wrote about visiting exhibitions, attending concerts, reading books that he had anticipated intensely, and feeling upon arrival the specific disappointment of a system that had already consumed the experience in advance. Charles Darwin documented something structurally similar in his autobiography. In his 50s, he noticed that his capacity for aesthetic experience had deteriorated in a specific and measurable way. He could no longer read poetry. Music had become irritating rather than moving. He attributed this to the exclusive demands of scientific work. What he was describing, with the precision of scientists observing his own decline, was a narrowing of the prediction system, a mind so thoroughly trained on one class of stimulation that it had lost the receptor sensitivity for others. What both Delacroix and Darwin describe is not depression in the clinical sense. It is something more specific, and in some ways more insidious, because it presents as normality. The person functions. They produce. They engage. But something that was once automatic, the capacity to be genuinely surprised by something good, has been replaced by a simulation of response. The system goes through the motions. The spike does not arrive. The invisible cost of a miscalibrated reward system is not the absence of pleasure. The absence of pleasure is visible. It announces itself. The invisible cost is a narrowing of the space in which meaning can be experienced. Because meaning, not in the philosophical sense, but in the neurological sense, depends on the same gap that dopamine measures, the gap between prediction and reality, between what was expected and what actually arrived. Collapse that gap, and the experience of significance becomes inaccessible, not because life contains less of it, because the system is no longer sensitive enough to detect it. Psychologist Martin Seligman at the University of Pennsylvania, in his research on learned helplessness in the 1960s and 70s, documented what happens when an organism repeatedly fails to find a meaningful connection between its actions and outcomes. The organism stops trying, not because it is incapable, but because the prediction system has learned that the gap between expectation and reality is always zero, in the wrong direction. The stimulation never produces what it was supposed to produce, and so the system stops issuing predictions. What remains is the flatness of a mind that has learned not to expect. Schopenhauer described a specific texture of a life that has lost access to genuine anticipation. He called it Langeweile, the German word for boredom, which translates literally as long time. The feeling that time has stopped moving because nothing sufficiently unpredictable is happening within it. What Schopenhauer identified phenomenologically and what Lemke documented neurologically is the same state. A prediction engine without predictions, a reward system that has learned to expect a reward before it arrives, and therefore experiences nothing when it does. The brain does not stop feeling excitement because the world has become less interesting. The world, by any objective measure, contains more available experience than at any previous point in human history. The brain stops feeling excitement because the system that was built to measure the gap between expectation and reality has been trained through continuous overstimulation to expect everything, and a system that expects everything experiences nothing as arrival. The question is not how to add more stimulation. More stimulation is precisely what produced the problem. The question is something older and more uncomfortable. What happens to a prediction engine when it is returned to conditions of genuine uncertainty? When the gap reopens? When something arrives that was not anticipated? The nervous system has a response prepared for that moment. It has been waiting. It simply has not caused a fire. The system did not break. It adapted. The difference matters because what adapts can adapt again in the other direction. Inner observer. Observe your mind. Understand reality.